This video will show you how to bleed Shimano brakes. This is something that you have to do if your brakes start to get spongy. In other words, the lever feels soft and the braking performance declines. It's also something that you have to do when you get a new set of brakes and you've got to cut the hydraulic lines to make them fit your bike. I did make another video that shows you actually how to cut and reinstall the hydraulic lines. So if you're doing that, watch that video first and then watch this one on how to bleed the Shimano brakes.
Here's what you're going to need to do this. You may need a 5mm wrench, especially if you're doing the rear brake, and that's to remove the caliper from the bike. You're going to need a 3mm Allen wrench, a 2.5mm Allen wrench. You're going to need this bleed block, and that's to put in the caliper because you've got to take the pads out before you do this. You're going to need a 7mm open-ended wrench, and then you're going to need some hydraulic fluid, some mineral fluid from Shimano. And what's nice about working with the Shimano brakes is this is mineral oil and it's not DOT brake fluid, which can be corrosive. So this, if you get it on your bike, it's not going to corrode the paint. So it's really easy to work with. You're also going to need this, it's called a Shimano bleed tool, and it's only about $5. And it's a really nifty tool. And this is the box that it comes in, so bleeding tool from Shimano. And then you're going to need some rubbing alcohol to wipe everything down when you're done with a rag or paper towel. Usually with this kit comes this tube, and this is to put on the bleed nipple. It's also very helpful to take that tube and wrap a plastic bag around it with a rubber band. So when you're bleeding the brake system, the mineral fluid can go inside the bag and not spill on the ground. The first step is to remove the brake pads from the caliper. And you will most likely get a little mineral oil on the caliper. And if you ever get mineral oil on the pads, it will ruin them and they have to be replaced. So take your 3mm Allen wrench, remove this bolt. And I already removed it, but there's usually a little retaining clip on the end of this that you need to pull off before you unthread the bolt. So pull that out. You're going to pull out the pads. Make sure you set them aside in a place where you won't spill any mineral oil during this process. And then you have to put the bleed block in because we're going to be squeezing the brake lever, and you cannot have those pistons freely move. They have to be able to squeeze down on that bleed block. And that way they don't get stuck. So I've got the bleed block in place, and I'm going to take my bolt and just, you don't have to tighten it all the way, just enough to hold that bleed block in place. And now you want to rotate your lever up so it's parallel with the ground, and you may need to loosen that with a 4mm Allen wrench to do that. So I've got this pretty parallel. And now I'm going to take my 2.5mm Allen wrench and loosen this bleed port screw right here. So I'm going to just take this off, and now we're going to install the bleeding tool. And this has a little base so you can set it on a workbench or on the ground. It also has this little plunger so that you can have mineral oil inside and not have it coming out when you install it or remove it. This will just thread onto this bleed port. And I've got some mineral oil in there, but I'm going to put some more so that it is about halfway full. Okay, so I filled this about halfway full, and that should be plenty. But as you're bleeding, keep an eye on it. It'll come down as you bleed, and typically this is plenty of mineral oil to do this. But if it ever gets down low and you're not done bleeding, in other words the lever is still not firm, then you need to add some more in there. But again, this should be plenty for this job. Okay, now that I've got the mineral oil inside this bleed tool, remove this plunger so that the mineral oil can go down inside the brake system. Okay, now it's time to move back down to the caliper end. And since this is a front brake, the caliper is much lower than the lever, so I'm going to leave it on the bike. If you're doing a rear brake, you're most likely going to need to remove the caliper and just let it hang down from the bicycle. Okay, it's got this little rubber cover on the bleed port, and the bleed port is this little nipple looking thing at the top. So I've already removed this, so I'm going to take it completely off. It's just easier to completely remove it. It does have a cap, but I just completely remove it. Now it's time to hook this tube up to give the mineral oil a place to go so it's not spilling out on the bike. Make sure that's firmly in place. Now I'm going to take my 7mm open-ended wrench and I'm going to loosen this bleed nipple. Now as I do, I'm going to see mineral oil start to fill the tube, and it's using gravity to feed it in from the bleed tool at the lever, and that's bleeding down inside the tube. And what's happening is any air bubbles that are inside are getting flushed out, and oftentimes you'll actually see bubbles come up inside. Leave that open a little bit, and again, keep an eye on the bleed tool, make sure that it's not getting too low. And now I'm going to close it off, and I'm going to check the lever. Okay, this lever feels firm. If it's not all the way firm, what you can do is put your wrench on, squeeze the lever, and you may have to have someone help you do this if you're doing the rear because you can't reach usually both. As you're squeezing the lever, open it with the wrench, close it before you let up on the lever, and then repeat that process maybe 3 or 4 times, and that's going to get some air bubbles out of the lever. So again, while squeezing the lever, use the wrench to open the bleed port, close the bleed port before you let up pressure on the lever, and then, like I said, repeat that 3 or 4 times. So I've got a really firm lever feel on this brake. So I am done with the bleed. Now it's just time to make sure this bleed nipple is tight. Okay, I'm going to remove this. I'm going to put the cover back on the bleed nipple, and then I'll go up to the lever end, and I'm going to remove the bleed tool. Alright, before you put the pads back in, take some rubbing alcohol on a paper towel or rag and really wipe down the caliper. Okay, make sure you get any bit of mineral oil off of the caliper. And I'm going to do the same thing in a minute up at the lever. So I've got all of any mineral oil that would have spilled out. And usually you'll get at least a few drops that come out. I'm also going to go ahead and take out the bleed block at this time. And I'm going to just take that same paper towel and just kind of get down inside there. Now, just as a note, you probably know this, but let me say it. Never squeeze a brake lever if you don't have either a pad or set of pads with either a rotor inside or one of those orange things that slip inside the rotors if you're transporting the bike, or a bleed block. Never allow the pistons to freely move by squeezing the lever. There's got to be something in there to give pressure to them. Okay, now it's time to put the pads in, and wash your hands real good. Make sure there's no mineral oil before you handle brake pads on your fingers. So these do have a left and right, so make sure you pay attention to that. Also make sure your spring excuse me, is still in there. So all you do is slide those in, put your bolt in, and then tighten them down and put your retaining clip, if you can see that, back on the other side. Okay, back up at the lever end, I'm going to put this plunger back down inside a little hole here so that I can remove this and mineral oil will not spill out. So unthread that. Before you put the screw back in the bleed port, take your mineral oil and just put a couple drops inside the hole so you see it kind of level with the surface there. And that makes sure that that reservoir is totally full before we put the bolt back on. Okay, now it's time to just put this screw back in the bleed port. And because that reservoir is totally full, you'll probably get just a little bit spillover, but that's okay. And take your 2.5 millimeter wrench, tighten this down, probably about 4 or 5 Newton meters. That's all you need. And now we want to wipe everything off with a rag and make sure everything's clean up here. Just take your paper towel or rag with rubbing alcohol and make sure everything's clean. Now again, I had this towel on here just to make it easier to see this, but it's probably not a bad idea to cover if you have foam grips or really any kind of grip with a rag or paper towel so that you don't get any mineral oil on there, because that could make your grips really slippery and it's really hard to get the mineral oil out of anything like a foam or even a rubber grip. Okay, that's it. Now you just put your lever back into the position that you want. Finish building your bike if you're building it up, or put your wheel back on, and you are ready to go.